Welcome to Inside the Media, a show that looks at the business of the news and the people who make it. I'm Michael Depp, editor of TV News Check, and your host. Today, we're going to be talking about the complicated frenemy relationship between news organizations and Facebook. It's a relationship that's interdependent but imbalanced, constantly evolving and unavoidable, as nothing can beat Facebook's massive reach with consumers. We'll have editors from the CBC and the Globe and Mail helping to unpack that relationship and explain why it's so important. Stay with us for Inside the Media and pop the media's hood and just see how that engine works. One of the most complex relationships in media today is the relationship between news organizations and social media platforms, especially Facebook. For newsrooms, Facebook can be indispensable as a tool to reach new audiences and interact with existing readers and viewers. But it's also commonly thought of in the news business as a frenemy. While it can be a great promotional platform for news groups, it's also a direct competitor with them for online revenue. To put that in perspective, Facebook generated $114.9 billion in US dollars in advertising revenue in 2021, and its total local advertising was $83.622 billion in 2021. No single media company, however large, comes remotely close to that. And there are more problems with the platform. Facebook and other social platforms have been a breeding ground for misinformation and disinformation, the enemies of the news business. And comments on Facebook posts are also a hothouse for incivility, bile, and even direct threats against the media and its sources. Here to help untangle some of the knots of this relationship are two people who work with Facebook every day. Rebecca Zaman is Audience Growth Manager at the Globe and Mail, and Andre Lau is Managing Editor of Digital News for the CBC. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Andre, how important a tool is Facebook for your newsroom in terms of connecting with your existing audience and finding new audiences?
I think it's undeniable how vast Facebook's reach and scope is. So, you have to be realistic about reaching audiences where Facebook is a habit. It's something they turn to all the time. So you need to be there in some form or another as a choice for them to consume news. Our existing audience on Facebook is loyal. They expect us to be creating content that they can find. In terms of new audiences, that's where we have an opportunity to reach people who don't normally come to CBC or wouldn't normally consider CBC as a source for their content. So to answer your question in a nutshell, it's an important tool for sure.
Rebecca, you describe Facebook as a fire hose. What does that mean?
Just exactly what Andre's saying. Facebook is where people are. News organizations want to be where people are. We want to get as many readers as possible. And as we know, people can be really selective about which news organizations they go to. If they're on Facebook, there's a wide variety to choose from. And there's also literally billions of people on the platform. So if you think about, getting stories out to readers from your website, you have a limited number of people. If you think about putting your stories onto Facebook, you have, I don't want to say unlimited number of people, but it's far less limited in terms of who is there of the potential audience.
So before we get into the problems, let's talk about the upsides. So Rebecca, in its most positive use, where do you see the gains from working with Facebook?
From a news organization standpoint, as to what I was saying, you can reach a huge swath of people you might otherwise not get to. They might be able to read your journalism, watch your journalism, and learn something more. And that can be applied to people from a diverse geographic region, diverse age-ish, it can really just open up doors for your organization. there's other ways that Facebook has proven itself to be really useful with things like its groups pages, forming communities, and that can happen for brands and news outlets as much as it can for your neighborhood.
And to come back on something you said, when you said age-ish, we're talking about a sort of, it skews in a specific age group, doesn't it?
Yes. So, I mean, Facebook has now been, it's out of its sort of baby years, and it's now solidly in its teens, which means that the age of the users has sort of gone up with them. Whereas it started as something for college, university students, quite literally on the campuses. Now, those people have aged with the site, and frankly, in a lot of ways, aged out of it. The primary users, I don't know exact numbers, but there has been a definite trend with Facebook users, and it's sort of more the 40 plus age group as opposed to the younger age groups that are using Facebook as their primary social media platform.
So I understand the Globe and Mail has a tool that actually uses AI, artificial intelligence, to select which of your stories should and shouldn't go onto Facebook. How does that work?
That's right. So it's part of our Sophie company, which is the Globe and Mail's tech company. And we use AI for a variety of purposes, including to select which stories are on Facebook from what we publish. And what it does is it sort of, much the same way as a human being does it. And again, this is informed with human beings looking at the rules. But we take a look at what performs well on Facebook. What are the stories that our audience is interested in on Facebook? And then publish them accordingly. So we have a huge volume of stories, much like CBC. Let me take that back. Not like CBC, but we do have a large volume of stories. We're not publishing 20 stories a day. We're publishing a couple of hundred. Not everything can go on Facebook. Not everything should go on Facebook, because that's not how the algorithm works either. That won't work to our benefit. So what Sophie does is it selects the stories that perform well on Facebook, by which I mean engagement, clicks, reach, all of those things that are the metrics by which you find success on Facebook, and post them there. And that also, as I said, is looked at by humans to determine if that makes sense from a news perspective as well.
I think it's interesting, and just as a side note, many people might not know this, but the fact that the Globe and Mail has a technology company and that you have to develop technology in-house. I don't know if a lot of people in the general public understand that in order for media companies to be competitive, many of them have developed these arms that cultivate and do R&D on new technology to stay in the game. So just with regards to that tool, though, and what you're choosing to put on and not to put on, is it kind of necessary to play that sort of content chess with Facebook?
When you say content chess, what do you mean exactly?
I mean, sort of really being strategic to a very granular level, making a decision on a story, but almost each story is a sort of pawn that you're moving forward on the board or choosing to not move forward.
I think you have to pick your battles. I think that at the end of the day, Facebook is going to work to its business interests, and you can't always predict what those will be. The same as the Globe and Mail and the CBC want to work to their business interests, as well as inform the public. As often you might find that Facebook is not on the same page as you when it comes to that. So being that granular about Facebook, I don't know that works very well for news outlets anymore, particularly larger ones. So I don't know that's a chess game so much as it's, I don't know, a dodgeball game. Throw things, determine what's working, and really lean into things when you can, but recognize that it is one tool in your arsenal, not the only thing.
So more rough and tumble and bruising, perhaps, if we go with the dodgeball metaphor. Let's look at the downsides at play. One often hears people saying that they get their news from Facebook. How much of a problem is that kind of conflation for you, Andre? Do you see that confusion happening often?
100%. People have come to see Facebook as a news source in an aggregated kind of way. And, you could run a test and say, well, which outlet created that? And I think most people wouldn't be able to recall what it was. So for media outlets, there's a brand issue of retaining that connection of this outlet did good journalism I saw it through Facebook, I'm going to come back to that outlet, right? And then there's the problem of disinformation and misinformation in that adjacency to news. So we often saw things happening in the comments under a CBC News link that was shared, and there will be discussion or other people bringing forward misinformation or disinformation, and people will read that and come away with it as, I saw that on Facebook, CBC reported it. But it was comments that were adjacent to a CBC link, right? So that's a problem that is hard for, I think, many people to disentangle.
And where media literacy plays a key role in fostering media literacy, to be able to parse those kinds of distinctions out.
That's right.
So Rebecca, there's a fundamental tension in place in that, as you touched on before, that Facebook doesn't want users to leave. It'll do anything to keep them on the platform. Globe and Mail wants those same users to follow outbound links to its own digital platforms as soon as possible, because that's where you can measure them. And you get both indirect and direct revenue, which is vital to staying in business. So, I mean, again, you spoke to this a little bit already, but how do you manage that tug of war?
A little bit of hope. I would say at the Globe, there is less focus on Facebook and, really trying to manage that tug of war and really fighting for those eyeballs, because I think that, it has proved to be a challenge with Facebook in the past. And they've said many, many times, Facebook, the company, has said, we don't prioritize news. We are an engagement platform. We are where people come to meet their community. And if you happen to get some news stories, they've said that. I mean, they've said it for various reasons, but they've said that. So I think that it's, I personally don't want to fight a losing battle, which is why I think it's so great that the Globe uses this AI that really sort of takes some of that pressure off in terms of really trying to, game Facebook in any way. There was a time when Facebook was very friendly with news organizations, really saw the benefit, I think, in what they promoted and didn't promote. But the fact is that news isn't always what people want to see. And, there's no way around that. Our jobs are different than people who are selling a product that, you want to use every day. What we are doing, sometimes we're entertaining, sometimes we're informing, and that isn't necessarily what people want when they're spending their leisure time, which is frankly how people use Facebook. That's what it's for. It's maybe they use it a bit for news and get their news. Maybe some people have really streamlined the way that they get their news feed, which, by the way, I should point out, Facebook, or Meta, changed the name of that last week. It was called the news feed for years. It's now called feed.
Right. All sorts of implications one can perhaps draw from that. Andre, you touched on the issue of disinformation and misinformation, that is incorrect, even dangerous information that's spread both deliberately and maliciously or inadvertently. Where is Facebook falling down on the job there and making your job as a news organization more difficult? How could it be doing a better job right now in reining that in?
I think if they have tools to prevent that from being widely distributed, that would make our jobs easier to, instead of focusing on the whack-a-mole of disproving false information, that we could focus on our jobs of reporting what is actually happening and giving people perspectives. It's a bit distracting to have to spend our energy countering things versus being able to talk to people and tell their stories. So I think just that initial being the gatekeeper of letting that information flow widely, broadly, and for a long period of time, I think Facebook could do a better job on that.
Andre, CBC made the decision last summer to suspend commenting on most of its content on Facebook, an experiment that it made permanent last fall. What was the initial reasoning behind that decision?
There were several reasons. At the heart of it was, is allowing commenting on our Facebook links sustainable for different parties involved. So number one, above all, our staff, the well-being of our staff who were encountering these comments, had to respond to them, or were the targets of harassment in them. And we heard a lot of, well, you just need a thicker skin. And I'd like to counter that it's not simply as simple as that. It's this drip, drip, drip of constant toxicity and harassment, and having to field that, 8 hours a day on a shift. And then secondly, the consideration for the people in our stories who found themselves the target of harassment and attacks simply because they were willing to share their stories or viewpoints in interviews. Thirdly, the well-being of commenters who got attacked by other commenters in the threads. And lastly, there is a cost to it. We have to pay people to moderate comments. So all of that were considerations in how sustainable is this platform of commenting going forward for our Facebook pages.
For the people in the newsroom who were being attacked, and for the sources, for that matter, for their stories who were being attacked, can you speak to how bad that problem was? What sort of psychological effects it had on them, so that people can understand who's at the other end, the receiving end of this kind of what might be just a flippant comment that someone might make?
So they often weren't flippant. They were vile. They were assaultive. Threats of finding people where they lived and raping them, finding somebody and beating them. And this would be attached to stories. I have an example of a young man who shared his story of getting COVID, his hospital experience, and what it was like. And somehow that generated comments like that. And that's a real life example where his family were tracked down, like their social accounts were tracked down, and people started going after them. Like that's the kind of example I'm talking about, where you think it's an innocuous story of someone sharing an experience with COVID turns into something like that. So then you can just imagine when it is a story about something that might be controversial or features a member of a community that is marginalized, you can just imagine what the abuse and harassment is like targeting them. And then for our staff who are simply just doing their jobs, to be attacked for being media or for reporting something or for just simply monitoring comments and messages, that they're being threatened with assault. So there is an impact on that. We did a survey during the pilot when comments were closed, asking our staff to rate or tell us how they felt before and during the pilot. And a lot of the answers were, I didn't realize how big of an impact it had on my well-being until it was turned off. And I think that was really telling, because in the thick of it, you don't realize the impact it's having on you day by day.
Rebecca, does the Globe and Mail have the same sorts of experiences?
We do have comments that are not great, but I don't think the vitriol is quite as strong on Facebook. Perhaps it's because of the selection of stories that is on there, but to be honest, it's not something that I have a great insight to.
Okay. Andre, what were the results that came of pushing the commentary off of Facebook ultimately and bringing it back onto your own digital properties? Where have you seen improvement, if at all, in terms of civility?
I would say it's negligible, to be totally honest. We haven't seen an increase in more civil discourse on our own properties, but we also haven't seen a decrease. I mean, I don't know what that says, but.
So they're bringing the hate over to the CBC various websites?
We haven't seen an increase in it, but we also haven't seen a decrease. Like the level has been, status quo. So I don't know what that says. Did the Facebook crowd find somewhere else to go? Did they give up on us? Are they going to end up migrating to our Instagram accounts? I don't know. But I will say that one of the things that happened as a result was we realized that we could share more stories featuring more diverse communities and subjects, because our staff were no longer trying to shield the interview subjects from harm in the comments. And so I would argue that that makes for a richer environment of the type of content that we're sharing and a more authentic representation of the journalism that we actually do versus before, when comments were open and we had to consider that when we were thinking about what stories we were sharing.
Of course, Facebook isn't the only social platform out there where news organizations like the CBC and Globe and Mail can brand themselves and find new audiences. What are some of the other places where you're trying to do that and you're finding some success, Rebecca?
Other platforms where we like sharing our content. Well, it all depends. I think what Michael and you and I have spoken previously, I talked about Apple News as being a place that is an excellent partner to the Globe and Mail. Why? Because it is literally where people are going for news. When people are on the Apple News app, it's because they want to be there to get the stories. They're not sort of having news stories thrust at them while they're trying to watch dance videos. So I think that it's, something like Apple News is great. Google, we've made some great progress with what's called the Google Showcase panels that they have. And, places like Twitter, which does lend itself a bit more naturally to news stories, maybe because it's, a bunch of journalists and, policy nerds on there who enjoy spending their time looking for this stuff, as well as many other excellent communities. Those are places where we certainly are, happy to play, but every different platform, has the same mandate. They want people to stay on their platform. They want people to be engaged in what they are selling. And that's fine. We're all doing the same thing, as you said previously. So just keeping that in mind, knowing what success looks like on different platforms, knowing that it's not going to be the same thing across the board. It's not going to be thousands of clicks on a story. It might mean something totally different. It might mean a recognition of what your brand stands for, the kind of journalism that you're producing, the kind of reporters that you have reporting for you. All of those things are meaningful in different ways. And knowing that those engagement metrics stand for something in different places. I'm thinking, for example, of Instagram, which is, of course, owned by Meta/Facebook, not a place where you're ever going to get a ton of traffic to your website, but you can be introduced to a whole new audience, a younger audience, in different ways. And that can really have benefits for sure.
Right. And Andre, we talked previously about CPCs making some forays onto Instagram as well.
Well, I wouldn't say forays. We've been on there, and it's exactly what Rebecca is saying, is being intentional about what success looks like on each platform and why you're there, is key to, in this world where we all have fewer and fewer resources, figuring out what we want out of each platform and serving the type of content that audiences on that platform expect, in the format that they expect it in. TikTok, obviously everyone keeps talking about it. We haven't fully jumped into that because we want to be authentic and match what an audience there might expect. You can't just jam news content into TikTok and expect it to work. So I think, these days it's approaching each social platform specifically and looking at what it is versus, I think, 10 years ago when we just threw everything onto everywhere.
And of course, an issue with Instagram is there are no outbound links. And so you really are self-contained inside of that platform. You have to go back to a profile to find any sort of link outward. So there's more friction in the process of trying to migrate them back to your own platforms. So ultimately, is it safe to say that this relationship with Facebook, uncomfortable as it may be, is here to stay? What do you think, Andre?
Yes. I mean, it's hard. Like I said, it's hard to deny that it is, it's a staple of people's lives, their online lives, especially for that very large demographic that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of this. But it is just one tool.
And Rebecca, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think that Facebook, has been around for a while, will continue to be around for a while. And it changes its priorities. You never know. They might swing the pendulum back and say, we've decided we really want to prioritize news outlets that provide, fact-checked articles and all of the good things that reporters and journalists want to see happen. Never know what can happen in the future. I'm optimistic about it, and also always open to opportunities where platforms will lend themselves to more people being informed.
Of course, the prospect may be also that you have to start preparing your news for the metaverse and whatever that looks like going forward as their investment.
Of course.
Okay, well, thank you to Andre Lau of CBC and Rebecca Zayman of the Globe and Mail for being here today. Thanks both of you very much. Cheers.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for Inside the Media. Thank you for watching and see you next time.